The former Harvard professor and partner to Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, passed away this week. After spending some time in Leary's experiments with hallucinogenic drugs, Alpert had a falling out with Leary, and then he got fired from Harvard for giving hallucinogenic drugs to undergraduate students. So he then chose to try to find his highs elsewhere. He went to India to study Hinduism, and out of that immersion in Eastern faith, he renamed himself Ram Dass and returned to the United States to become a spiritual teacher and writer. He became very popular with the kind of people who seemed to like that sort of thing. And I don't want to just throw shade on him, but most of what he said looked to me like word salad, as if maybe he wasn't entirely through with those hallucinogenic drugs. Some of his teachings seemed to be loving and kind and life-affirming, the kind of stuff that makes a nice t-shirt or a meme. Nothing too challenging, sort of like a nice spoonful of honey in a cup of hot tea, but as my father used to like to say, even a blind hog finds an acorn now and then. But a lot of what this pseudo-spirituality offers is important sounding words that don't really mean anything. The most fundamental anxiety that has cursed human beings since our ancestors first became conscious is our awareness that we are mortal. In face of this huge issue, Alpert says, the ego is frightened by death because it is part of the incarnation that ends with it. That's why we learn to identify with our soul as our soul continues after death. For the soul, death is just another moment. Now, for saying things like this, thousands of people were willing to portray him as if he were some kind of spiritual savant, a Buddha, if not a Christ of sorts. But what is he talking about? What is a soul? Where is a soul? What is it made of? Where does it go when that moment of death arrives? Do only humans have souls? Or is it true that all dogs go to heaven? And why just humans and dogs? The reason why mice are used in medical experiments is because humans and mice share 85% of the same DNA. So do mice have souls? For that matter, fruit flies have 65% of the same DNA as humans. Do fruit flies have souls? And I don't want to stretch this, but if you'll bear with me, bananas have 50% of the same DNA as humans. Do bananas have souls? Does corn or trees or grass? Are VeggieTales, in fact, an animated children's religious education series or Ram Dass style? Are VeggieTales just a documentary of the religious life of salads? The whole shtick of these pseudo-spiritual teachers is to tell people what they want to believe and to try to make their wishes seem to be plausible. Yes, the ego fears death because it's difficult for us to imagine that the universe would have the temerity to go on without us. Narcissistically, we hold on to an entirely unverified and implausible certainty that while we may have had a beginning, maybe something inglorious like a moment in the back seat of a 1950 Chevy, but our essence has no end, that somehow that instance of glands calling to glands created an eternal entity that will live throughout all time. C.S. Lewis fairly cleverly works the whole journey from this world into the next in his 7-part series, The Narnia Chronicles. You see attempts at making it seem believable in Robin Williams' movie, What Dreams May Come. Such great authors as M. Scott Peck and John Shelby Spong have written speculative pieces about what form eternity might take, And in each case, the argument seems to be simultaneously pretty disappointingly hollow, and rather than convince us, it seems to somehow erode the credibility of the authors, that maybe they just shouldn't have tried that. These are all efforts at comforting us, though, in the face of our fear of mortality. But really, honestly, does anyone really believe it? I've personally witnessed any number of very, very devout religious people who watch their oncoming death with desperation, willing to undergo the most extreme of medical procedures in order to wring just another few days out of the life of this mortal coil. Yet Western religions have all claimed to have a product to sell that is the ultimate cure for mortality, whether it's Judaism, Islam, or Christianity. And no matter how elaborately we decorate our cathedrals, or our coffins, or our tombs for that matter, it's always a kind of whistling past the graveyard, both figuratively and literally, isn't it? I've lately been taken with the work of the Swedish philosopher Martin Hägglund, who persuasively argues in his book, This Life, that mortality is not what takes meaning away from us, but the fact that our lives are limited is what actually invests every day with meaning and purpose. He says, far from making my life meaningful, eternity would make it meaningless, since my actions would have no purpose. What I do, what I love, can matter to me only because I understand myself to be immortal. Now, I hope this is self-evident, but if life went on indefinitely, there's nothing you really have to do today, because there's always another tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. Saving the earth loses meaning, because what is the earth if we go on in another existence? Preventing deaths, whether by wars or by disease, doesn't really mean anything. There's always a tomorrow and an infinite line of tomorrows, which makes today virtually worthless. A recent issue of the U.S. Catholic dared to ask the question, will heaven be boring? And they tried to persuasively say no, suggesting that we'll always have work to do, that we will always have activity for social concerns. M. Scott Peck tried to make the same argument, but to my reading, Scott Peck made heaven sound like eternal committee meetings. I have spent my entire adult life trying to avoid committee meetings, and I can't imagine an eternity of that making much sense. Mark Twain was telling a joke when he made the observation that most people can barely endure an hour in church, and yet they have some hope of spending all of eternity singing hymns and praying and basically being in church. Seriously, even if it were real, would anybody want to go there? Hägglund says, instead of lamenting the absence of eternity, we should acknowledge the commitment of finite life as a condition for anything to be at stake and for anyone to lead a genuinely free life. It's similar to the story of Midas, who was so greedy for gold that he begged the gods to give him the power to turn anything he touched into gold. The story is not simply tragic because he touched his daughter thoughtlessly and turned her into gold, but he also starved to death because he couldn't touch food without turning it into gold. It is that gold has value because it is rare. If gold were abundant, it would be boring, inconvenient, and heavy. If you're a meat eater, and evidently I am, I love sitting down to a nice medium rare steak, but if I were obligated to sit down to eat a cow, that would be torturous, particularly if I was then charged to eat a herd, or eat all of the herds, or eat an infinity of herds of cows. It becomes a reductio ad absurdum, doesn't it? Even for someone who has an appetite like mine, which is considerable. Life has meaning only because it is finite. Our mortality is what makes life precious. Precious to such a degree that we're not even afraid to say sacred. Today is important because we don't know how many more todays we have. And so today needs to be used. It needs to be embraced in an enthusiastic way. 20 years ago, I outlined a novel that I have not yet managed to write. The main character of my novel is a philosophy professor who has received a terminal cancer diagnosis. So he realizes he's only got one more semester in which to say everything he wanted to say in an entire career. That he's got to get it done. And so the premise of the novel then allows me to articulate the things that I think are the most important, the most profound things to be said. I have grown old, however, working on other books, and that novel is still waiting to be written. But lately, however, I've realized as a senior citizen that I've come to the point where I'm kind of living that novel. I hope I've got more than 1 or 2 semesters left in me, but after 41 years of preaching, I realized that the number of times that I'm going to get to stand at a pulpit with a gathered audience to hear what I think, that number is a lot smaller than it was when I started. For me, for you, for all of us, our time here may be longer or shorter, but it is not infinite. And the brevity of life should inspire us to relish it, to use it, to make it as meaningful as possible. Now, I don't want to be flip about this topic. I know that people invented a belief in a soul and an afterlife, not just to give people like Ram Dass an income from gullible people, but because belief in an afterlife is a solution to 2 urgent human problems. The first is fear of death, and the second is the grief that we experience about the death of people we love. Before I ever preached my first sermon as a pastor, I preached my first funeral. I was 22 years old, was moving to a parsonage in La Center, Kentucky. The U-Haul was still loaded and in the driveway of the parsonage, and the funeral director drove over and told me to put on a black suit and to follow him. Since that day in 1978, I have had to help survivors cope with the grief of loss in hundreds, if not more than 1,000 funerals. The services attached to untimely deaths were the most painful and therefore the most memorable. Infant deaths. If you've never carried an infant coffin in your arms, it's just so hard. Car accidents that involve teenagers, domestic murders, suicides. I can remember every one of them, and they are all still nauseatingly with me. I can feel them, and there have been a lot. So you don't have to explain to me why we have needed a heaven in order to not be crushed by grief. Now that we are not confined to the limitations of a single congregation, because we have an internet congregation that numbers in the thousands, it is a rare week when I'm not called upon by someone from California or New York or Great Britain or Australia begging me to comfort them with some promise that life does go on, that their teenage daughter who committed suicide or their friend who died in an untimely accident will continue to live. I do not doubt that such requests are what motivated both Scott Peck and Bishop John Shelby Spong to write the books that they wrote, trying to hold out some thin hope of an unknowable afterlife. But if you turn to me for anything but an honest answer, you are setting yourself up for disappointment. Rather than inventing an imaginary afterlife, I believe that people of faith have honest and meaningful things to do to address their mortality. And for years, we've had on the front cover of our bulletin the list of things of what it means to be a progressive. But I've kind of written my own 10 commandments in light of the brevity of life. I don't know if you can read all of that. But because life is finite and therefore it is precious, We must expand health care to include everyone, to stop the senseless and needless suffering and premature deaths of tens of thousands of people every year. And if you're one of those people who argue against universal health care because it's too expensive, but you have health care and you want to keep this system that we've got in place that either prices or outright excludes millions of others, then you better hope that I'm wrong about there not being an afterlife, because you're going to go to hell, and you ought to. If you are so selfish that you are willing to preserve a system that literally has a casualty count in excess of 60,000 people a year, then you know you belong in hell, you selfish bastard. And secondly, we need to take the profit motive out of healthcare and make the point of healthcare taking care of people who need healthcare. Most people die of either heart disease or cancer, and a growing number suffer from various forms of dementia. So spend money on research on those things that are killing people. Besides, we have several ED pills now, and cosmetic surgery is good enough. We've got to take profit out of the medical research system. And because life is sacred, we need to decriminalize drug addiction and start treating it as what it is, an illness and not a crime. 60,000 opioid deaths a year, and we keep building prisons to address that? How much longer until we admit that criminalizing addiction causes addiction and that treatment actually addresses the problem? And fourth, don't make me remind you that Moses got 10. I'm just kind of staking out my lane here. Rather than federally subsidizing the crops that are killing us, wheat, soy, corn, rice, and sugarcane, subsidize clean water projects and restore family farms by supporting the local production of fruits and green vegetables. Because life is precious, and we should underwrite what it takes to sustain life. And with 15 to 20,000 suicides a year, if life is important, if life is precious, can't we see that we need to provide adequate mental health care so that people can see a better option than causing their own deaths? And on a sadly related front, we must outlaw or strictly control the sale and ownership of assault rifles and handguns. We're now at more than 40,000 deaths a year, with another 100,000 gunshot wounds and injuries. Anyone who claims that this is acceptable because I like my guns, you like a product that has killed 1 million people in the last generation and wounded another 2.5 million, and you still think that's a form of entertainment for you? You need to rewind to the part of this message where I described where the people that want to keep this healthcare system need to go. There's room for you. And we've made it possible for people to work their way out of the misery of poverty only when we have a progressive tax system and a living wage. Years ago, the world ran their economy on serfs and lords. Then we had slaves and masters. Now we've got the minimum wage, which is not that much different. Surely it's time for us to pay everyone who works enough to have a decent life. If the success of your business is dependent upon the impoverishment of your employees, then we don't need your business. Sorry, having a class society of serfs and slaves or the working poor is not acceptable because life is short and therefore sacred. After drugs and guns, the largest cause of death other than illness is car accidents. We've succeeded in making cars and roads safer, but only by degrees. We need safe, efficient, non-polluting mass transit. The technology exists, and the moral excuses for not building it have expired. Number 9 is this: Through pollution and putting toxins in our food, our water, and our air, we are shortening human lives and making the entire planet uninhabitable. Nothing short of a wartime scale of Green New Deal can be considered at this point. We are literally poisoning ourselves as if we were going to live forever, and neither our bodies nor our planet matters in that scenario. That is clearly not true, and it's time for us to act on what is true and get our heads out of the clouds. Finally, we just managed to wipe out polio and some other plagues. We need to concentrate efforts on stemming the spread of or wiping out altogether HIV, malaria, and other communicable lethal diseases, because illnesses that shorten the lives of people on other continents destabilizes the globe and makes life less safe for all of us. Now, some of you, I know, some of you here in the room and many of you listening are convinced that I'm wrong about everything I've said today. I can only invite you to pay attention to my sermon on logical probability that I'll deliver here on January 26th. Between now and then, I would encourage you to study Bayes' theorem. And if that seems complicated, I've got, next slide, some explanations of it. But I can boil it down for you. What this basically means is I'm right. But what you really want from your spiritual teachers is something that makes you feel good, even if it's not true, you can find Ram Dass on YouTube.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.